Hello friends, it's Kat from Meow, Kapow. One of the sets I recommended back when I compared the Lucas student watercolor set to their professional set was this palette of St. Petersburg White Nights Watercolors. For less than $20 US, you get 12 supersized whole pans of paint in a really nice and fairly well-designed array. There's a set of split primaries, meaning a warm and cool version of red, yellow, and blue, as well as 2 greens, 3 earth colors, and a neutral black. The mixing range of this set is, therefore, pretty huge for a small kit. When you open the box up, you may notice that the space in which the paints are contained is filled with a clear plastic contraption to hold the paints in place. I'll admit that this is one of the weirdest things about this palette, and if you look closely at it while assembled, you'll also notice that the separators block some of your access to the paint with their overhang. I personally found this a bit annoying, but because the pans are so large anyway, I never felt like I didn't have enough access to the paints. After unwrapping them, labeling, swatching, rearranging in an order I prefer, and swatching again, placing the paints back into the palette was quick and simple. Certainly faster than a metal palette with those snap rails. To test all the colors individually, I drew out little fruit doodles and did some wet on wet to check the way the paint blooms in water, some glazing to check if they layer on top of themselves well, and some lifting to see if they reactivated well once dried. They don't tend to spread a lot when applied wet on wet, but they glaze extremely well and lift superbly as well. I'm also really delighted with that bright, cool carmine red especially, but a lot of the colors really look superb when just painted by themselves. One disappointing aspect is that a lot of the colors were opaque or semi-opaque, such as both the cadmium yellows, the cadmium red, and the yellow ochre. This isn't surprising because cadmium colors and yellow ochre are known to not be transparent colors, but it does mean that anything these colors are mixed into will end up looking a bit dull. If you saw the brush review I did for those inexpensive Meeden brushes, you saw that effect in the doodle finder I did to demonstrate, and I personally feel like a lot of the skin tones I created and the oranges lacked a bit of clarity. I personally prefer bright, clean, super saturated colors when working, but that doesn't mean these aren't usable. In fact, about a year ago, I happened to play with almost these exact colors and started but never finished a portrait of Bill Nye the Science Guy. I noticed back then that the colors always seemed to come out duller than I'd anticipated, though at the time I didn't know that was down to so many of the paints themselves being opaque. Also, one thing worth noting is that these are the only paints I've ever had that developed mold on them. While painting that Bill Nye piece forever ago, I lazily left my mixed washes inside the little mixing lid of a water bucket I regularly use. I am a convenience painter and rarely take the time to clean my mixing spaces because I like to go back and use the same mixes, especially if I'm still in the middle of a piece. It took me a couple of days to get back to trying to work on Bill, and when I opened up my water bucket to use the mixes I'd stored in the lid, they'd all gone moldy. Now, that was essentially the ideal breeding ground for mold because there was still water in the bucket and the lid being on meant that there was no light and it probably got a bit warm. But I've done this a ton of times with a lot of different paints for varying amounts of time, and the White Nights paints are the only ones who have ever developed mold. But I'm pretty sure that if you, at very least, let the paints dry out before covering them up in the palette rather than inside of a water bucket, you'll be just fine. By the way, one of the things that I noticed while making all these little Adventure Time doodles is that pretty much every color granulates in some way, which is awesome. I personally have grown to love a bit of texture in my work, and despite the fact that such texture might not necessarily match the usually smooth and vivid coloring of this cartoon, I like the way these all came out. Actually, I don't really have any problems with the way the paint performed itself. As mentioned earlier, I'm a bit disappointed that there are a number of non-transparent colors included in this selection because I do think it contributed to some of my characters looking a bit more dull than I'd prefer, but that's down to the colors chosen for this set rather than the performance of the paint. I also really appreciated that these glaze well because I used that to my advantage while giving a bit of depth to Marceline's hair, even though it was all just entirely the neutral black color. And the lifting capabilities? When it came to making the transitions in Lady Rainicorn's rainbow body a bit less harsh, being able to reactivate each strip and blend it just a bit was really wonderful. So all in all, especially for the super affordability of these professional and quite light fast paints, I really recommend them. If you're a beginner but want to get the best paints you can start with, I think this is a great option because the performance won't let you down and the price won't break the bank. And you can expand your collection as you develop without having to worry about your older paintings fading away to nothing from the sun. And painters that want to use these professionally, I definitely see the draw in White Nights because I was never once frustrated with using the paint. But I think that the box itself is the biggest problem. I mentioned earlier that the dividers holding the paint in place stop you from accessing the full pan, and that's sort of annoying, but not terribly bad. One issue I had with this theoretically travel palette was the size itself is too large to comfortably hold in your hand, and the lack of a finger ring means that you've either got to have very large hands or somewhere to place this down. Of course, you could always take a cell phone ring and attach it to the back like I did in my studio travel palette build, but we're looking at this box as is rather than as could be. Also, if there's any liquid left in your lid when you go to close it, you're going to end up with quite a mess. It's easy to not notice that there's still some liquid in the lid, by the way, because part of your view of the full lid is obstructed by the body of the palette, since it actually goes under the base when fully opened. Even if you manage to not spill paint everywhere while closing, if there is liquid still in the lid when you pack up, you run the risk of forming mold, like I had. Even still, I originally got my set for $17, and it seems like White Nights paints are available worldwide through various websites, including Jackson's, for which there's an affiliate link down in the doobly-doo. I spend a lot of time thinking about what paint sets are available throughout the entire journey of a painter, and I especially like to find sets that would make someone just starting out happy enough that they'd continue to explore. Given the price range, the quality, and the overall availability of these paints, I think I can safely say that this is one of the top 5 palettes I'd recommend, not just for a beginner, but for anyone looking for good paints and a great bargain. But I'm curious, what would you recommend to someone who's starting their watercolor journey for the first time today? And why? Until I see you next time, I wish you peace, love, and math. Bye!